Ladies and gentlemen, tonight the United States Coast Guard is proud to recognize Lieutenant Grant Vasquez for exceptional judgment under pressure, decisive command, and the kind of quick thinking that averted what could have been a catastrophic maritime disaster off the coast of Maine. 200 people in dress uniforms and formal attire raised their glasses in the Officers Club at Portland's Coast Guard base. In the back row, a weathered man in a borrowed sport coat, 2 sizes too large, sat with his hands folded in his lap, watching a young officer accept an award for a decision that had not, in fact, been his. What none of the officers in that room knew, what even Grant Vasquez himself didn't fully understand yet, was that the man sitting quietly in the back row had spent 26 years learning to read a stretch of water so well that he'd found, with his own eyes and a hand-cranked signal lamp, a shifted sandbar the Coast Guard's own automated sensors had missed entirely, 2 months after that same Coast Guard decided his job no longer needed to exist. My name is Owen Bracken. I'm 54 years old. For most of my life, I believed one simple thing. Some knowledge only lives in a person who's spent enough years watching the same patch of ocean to feel it change before the instruments do. I still believe that. I just learned, standing in a decommissioned lighthouse, watching a freak fog roll in off Cape Hollow, that an agency can decide a man's decades of accumulated judgment are obsolete right up until the exact moment they desperately need it again. I grew up in the keeper's house at Cape Hollow Light, 40 miles up the coast from Portland, the 3rd generation of Brackens to tend that station. My grandfather kept the light through 2 world wars. My father, Elias Bracken, kept it for 38 years after him, until his hands got too unsteady for the climb, and I took over the post at 28, the same year he handed me his logbooks, 40 volumes of handwritten weather observations, current patterns, and shoal movements going back to 1961, information that had never once, in all that time, made it into any official Coast Guard database. Cape Hollow is one of the last staffed lighthouses on the eastern seaboard, kept manned long after most stations converted to automation, because the waters approaching Windward Harbor sit above an unusually unstable seabed, shifting sandbars that move with every major storm in ways no fixed sensor array has ever fully anticipated. For 26 years, my job was simple to describe and nearly impossible to formally document. I watched the water. I watched the fog. I learned, the way my father learned before me, to recognize the specific texture of danger before any instrument confirmed it. Psychologists who study expertise development call this tacit knowledge accumulation, the specific, difficult-to-articulate competence that develops only through extended direct experience with a complex, variable system, knowledge that resists being reduced to a checklist or a sensor threshold, precisely because its value lies in synthesizing thousands of small observed variables at once. I'd spent 26 years building exactly that kind of knowledge. The Coast Guard, facing budget pressure and a modernization mandate from Washington, decided it could be replaced by a $200,000 automated sensor array. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because a single ceremony only makes sense once you understand the 2 months that came before it. Lieutenant Grant Vasquez arrived at Cape Hollow on a Tuesday morning in September, 31 years old, sharp, ambitious, 3 years into a career track that clearly included considerably more promotion ahead of him than most officers his age, sent to oversee the decommissioning of my post as part of a fleet-wide automation initiative. He walked me through the new sensor arrays specifications in the keeper's house kitchen. LiDAR-based fog detection, automated foghorn triggering, remote monitored navigation lighting, all of it. On paper, more precise and more consistent than a human observer working 16-hour shifts through a Maine winter. I want to describe that first meeting in more detail because I think the specific tone of it matters. Vasquez laid a tablet on my father's old kitchen table, the same table where 3 generations of Brackens had eaten breakfast before climbing those lighthouse stairs, and pulled up a presentation clearly prepared for exactly this kind of conversation. Cost projections, reliability statistics from 4 other decommissioned stations, a modernization timeline stretching back to a congressional budget directive 2 years earlier. He was courteous throughout, even sympathetic in the practiced way officers are trained to deliver difficult news. "I don't doubt your dedication, Mr. Bracken," he said. "I've read your service record. 26 years without a single missed shift is remarkable. But dedication and data are 2 different conversations, and the data on this system is very clear." I told him, as respectfully as I could manage, that the array's fog detection calibration was based on historical seabed mapping data that hadn't been updated in 4 years, and that Cape Hollow's shoal system shifted enough after major storms that the sensors would need considerably more frequent manual recalibration than the maintenance schedule allowed for. Vasquez listened politely, and then told me something I've thought about often since. "Mr. Bracken," he said, "I understand this station means a great deal to you personally. But the Coast Guard has run extensive modeling on this exact system across 4 other decommissioned stations, and the data consistently shows automated monitoring outperforms human observation on every measurable safety metric. I need you to understand this isn't a reflection of your service. It's simply where the technology has arrived. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters before we go further. If you'd spent 26 years building a kind of expertise that couldn't be fully captured in any official metric, and a younger official with considerably less field experience told you, politely but firmly, that your accumulated judgment was being replaced by a sensor array, would you have fought the decision loudly? Or would you have done what I did, documented your concerns formally, and quietly kept watching the water anyway, right up until your last contracted day? Type 1 if you'd have fought it loudly from the start. Type 2 if you'd have documented your concerns and kept doing the work quietly instead. Or tell me, has an institution ever told you your years of hands-on judgment mattered less than a system that had never actually been tested in the exact conditions you knew best? Because what happens next in the fog off Cape Hollow will make you rethink everything you just answered. I drove down to see my father that weekend, 86 now, living in a small assisted care facility in Portland, his hands too unsteady these days for the climb up any lighthouse stairs, but his mind still sharp enough to understand every word I told him. I sat beside his chair and explained the automation order, the sensor array, Vasquez's calm, confident dismissal of everything the logbooks recorded. He was quiet a long moment, the particular stillness he'd always carried before saying something he wanted me to actually remember. "Owen," he said, "when the Coast Guard first offered to automate this station back in the 80s, I fought it too, and I lost that fight for almost a decade because the technology back then genuinely wasn't good enough yet. This time might be different. Machines are smarter now than they were in my day. But here's the thing I want you to hold on to regardless of how this turns out. A sensor can measure what the water is doing right now. It can't remember what the water did the last 4 times a nor'easter hit this exact coastline because it doesn't have 40 years of logbooks living inside it the way you do. You keep watching until your last contracted hour, whether or not anyone in Washington believes that watching still matters. The water doesn't care what the budget says. Psychology note. What Elias was describing to his son reflects a distinction cognitive scientists draw between explicit and tacit expertise, the recognition that some forms of professional judgment, built through thousands of hours of pattern recognition across variable conditions, resist full transfer into formal systems precisely because their value lies in synthesizing subtle, hard to quantify signals that a rules-based system, however sophisticated, has not yet learned to weight correctly. I filed a formal written objection to the automation timeline through proper Coast Guard channels, citing the outdated seabed mapping data and requesting, at minimum, a full storm season observation period before the station transitioned to fully automated operation. My request was reviewed and denied within 11 days, the response citing the same modeling data Vasquez had already described, along with a note that my 40 years of family logbooks, while, quote, appreciated as a historical record, did not constitute data suitable for incorporation into the automated system's current calibration protocol. For the final 2 months of my contracted service, I continued my full duties exactly as I always had, watching the water, recording conditions in my father's logbook tradition, even though I now understood, plainly, that nobody in an official capacity intended to read another word of it. I also, quietly, without informing Vasquez, spent several of those final weeks personally surveying the shoal system by small boat during calm weather windows, sounding depths by hand the way my father had taught me, cross-referencing what I found against the automated array's official seabed map. What I found troubled me considerably. A significant nor'easter 3 weeks into the transition period had shifted the primary sandbar nearly 40 yards further into the main shipping channel than the automated system's calibration reflected, a discrepancy the sensor array, designed to detect fog density and surface conditions rather than to independently resurvey the seabed, had no mechanism to catch on its own. I documented the discrepancy formally, with GPS coordinates and depth soundings, and submitted it again through Coast Guard channels. It was logged, acknowledged, and scheduled for review during the array's next quarterly maintenance cycle, 6 weeks after my own final contracted day at the station. 6 weeks after my last day, on a Thursday night in November, a 210,000-ton cargo tanker called the Meridian Star approached Windward Harbor's main channel during a fog bank thick enough to reduce visibility to less than 30 feet, exactly the kind of conditions Cape Hollow's automated system was designed to detect and respond to. The system's LiDAR array, calibrated to seabed data now nearly 2 months out of date, registered the channel as clear along its charted course, a course that ran directly across the shifted sandbar I had personally surveyed and reported 6 weeks earlier. I want to tell you how I came to be standing in that decommissioned lighthouse at all that night, because I hadn't planned to be there. I'd kept a small apartment in Windward Harbor after vacating the keeper's house, close enough that old habit still occasionally pulled me down to the shoreline on foggy nights, a kind of restlessness I hadn't fully shed in 6 weeks of formal retirement. I was walking the shore path near the lighthouse that Thursday evening when I heard the Meridian Star's foghorn, distant, steady, following a course I recognized immediately from 26 years of watching that exact channel, as dangerously close to where the sandbar had shifted. I climbed the lighthouse stairs on instinct, using a key I technically should have already surrendered, and found the automated system's monitoring terminal still displaying a clear channel reading. I radioed the Coast Guard station directly. Lieutenant Vasquez himself answered, his voice tight with the controlled urgency of an officer managing an active situation. "Mr. Bracken," he said, "this is an active navigation event. I need this channel clear." I told him, as plainly and urgently as I could manage, that the Meridian Star was on a collision course with a shoal his own sensor array hadn't recalibrated for. Since the September storm, the exact discrepancy I'd documented and submitted 6 weeks earlier. Vasquez's response has stayed with me since. "Mr. Bracken, our system shows a clear channel. I need you to stay off this frequency." I understood in that moment that I had perhaps 4 minutes before the Meridian Star's current course carried it directly into water shallow enough to tear open its hull. I want to describe those 4 minutes in more detail because I've relived them often since. The lantern room was cold, the automated arrays, small status lights, a blinking green, and confident in the corner, utterly indifferent to what I could see with my own eyes through fog thick enough to swallow the tanker's running lights almost entirely, its foghorn the only clear signal of exactly how close it had already come. I remember my hands shaking slightly as I located the old signal lamp's hand crank. Buried under a canvas tarp, nobody had bothered to remove during the automation installation, and thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even in the moment, that my grandfather had stood in this exact spot cranking this exact mechanism during a hurricane in 1953, and that the lamp had never once, in 70 years, failed to do the one thing it was built to do. Psychology note. What Vasquez was experiencing in that moment reflects a documented phenomenon called automation bias, the tendency of even highly trained professionals to overtrust a technological system's output during time-pressured decisions, particularly when that system has performed reliably in prior instances, making it considerably harder to override in the exact rare moment its underlying data has actually become dangerously outdated. I did the only thing left available to me. Cape Hollow's manual signal lamp, the original 1961 mechanism my grandfather had operated by hand before electrification, still sat in the lantern room, decommissioned, but, I knew from 26 years of maintaining it myself, still mechanically functional. I climbed the final flight of stairs, hand-cranked the lamp's rotation mechanism, and began signaling the International Maritime Danger pattern directly at the Meridian Star's bridge. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short, repeated. The same pattern my father had taught me as a teenager on a night considerably calmer than this one. The Meridian Star's own bridge crew, trained to recognize that exact signal regardless of what any shore-based sensor claimed, altered course within 90 seconds, cutting hard to port and clearing the shifted sandbar by a margin the ship's own subsequent incident report would describe as approximately 60 meters. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If a machine and a human being disagree about a life-threatening situation, and the machine has been right every time before this exact moment, how much doubt does a person in charge owe to the machine before trusting the human standing right in front of them instead? I've turned that question over more times than I can count since that November night, and I still don't have a fully comfortable answer. The formal Coast Guard incident report, filed within 72 hours, credited Lieutenant Vasquez with, quote, decisive emergency coordination that facilitated the Meridian Star's successful course correction based on his radio contact with the vessel during the event. The report mentioned an unauthorized civilian transmission from the decommissioned Cape Hollow station only in a single footnote, noting it as a contributing factor of undetermined reliability, since I had, technically, no longer held any official Coast Guard authorization to be operating that signal lamp at all. I didn't contest the report immediately. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me understood that an agency embarrassed by its own outdated sensor calibration had every institutional incentive to frame the story as a successful automated response rather than an admission that a system it had championed publicly had nearly caused a maritime disaster its own decommissioned lighthouse keeper had warned them about in writing 6 weeks earlier. What changed my mind was a phone call 4 days later from the Meridian Star's own captain, a careful, direct woman named Captain Ines Oduya, who had reviewed her own bridge's radio logs and radar footage and wanted, in her own words, the actual record corrected before any formal board of inquiry closed the matter. "Mr. Bracken," she said, "my bridge crew has sworn statements ready. We altered course because of your signal lamp, not because of any Coast Guard radio transmission. I don't know what politics are at play on your end, but I'm not signing off on an incident report that erases the man who actually kept my ship and crew off that sandbar." Captain Oduya's formal statement, along with her bridge crew's sworn timeline and the ship's own navigation data logs, went to the Coast Guard's Board of Inquiry 6 weeks later, alongside the seabed survey documentation I had submitted and been dismissed 2 months earlier. The board's review took 11 weeks. Their final report, released the following February, confirmed that the automated sensor array's outdated calibration had directly contributed to the near collision that my written warning 6 weeks prior had accurately identified the exact hazard, and that the Meridian Star's course correction had occurred specifically in response to manual signal lamp operation from Cape Hollow Light, not from any Coast Guard radio coordination. I want to tell you about the day that report became public, because it wasn't the vindication I expected it to feel like. Not entirely. A former colleague forwarded me a copy, and I read all 31 pages sitting in my small Windward Harbor apartment, and what I felt wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, the specific relief of watching an accurate record finally replace a convenient 40 years of family logbooks, finally acknowledged as exactly the kind of evidence they'd always actually been. 3 weeks after the report's release, the Coast Guard held a second, considerably smaller ceremony at Cape Hollow itself rather than the Portland Officers Club, formally recognizing my role in preventing the Meridian Star incident and, in a decision I hadn't expected, reinstating Cape Hollow Light's staffed status pending a full independent review of the automated system's reliability during severe seabed shift conditions. Vasquez attended that ceremony too, and found me afterward near the lighthouse's base, visibly uncertain whether to approach at all. "I owe you a conversation more honest than my radio call that night," he said. "I trusted the system because it had never let me down before, and I didn't have a framework, in that exact moment, for weighing your 26 years against a sensor readout I'd been told was reliable. I told him I understood that better than he probably expected me to. Trusting a system that's worked before isn't a character flaw, I said. It's just not the whole job. The whole job is knowing when the system might be wrong and being humble enough to check with the person who's been wrong the least, over the longest amount of time, before deciding you already know the answer. I want to tell you about something that happened the following spring, because I think it completes this story better than any Board of Inquiry report could. My father, well enough that week for the drive, came out to Cape Hollow too to see the station reinstated in person, and I helped him slowly up the first few steps of the lighthouse, as far as his knees would carry him, before we sat together on the stone landing, looking out at a calm blue stretch of water neither one of us had ever fully trusted to stay predictable. The water doesn't care what the budget says he signed, more to himself than to me, echoing what he'd told me months earlier. Then he smiled, small and satisfied, and added something new. But every now and then, it seems the budget eventually has to care what the water actually did. This story reminds us of something most of us already know but rarely say out loud. Some kinds of knowledge only exist inside a person who has spent years paying close, patient attention to something everyone else has decided is already fully understood. Maybe you know someone like Owen, quietly holding expertise an institution has decided is no longer necessary. Maybe you've been told yourself that your years of hard-won judgment matter less than a newer, faster, more confident system that has simply never yet been tested in the exact conditions you know best. If that's you, here's what I want you to do tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. Write down, plainly, one piece of knowledge you've earned through years of direct experience that no manual, no system, and no younger official confident in their own training could have handed you any faster. Date it. Keep it somewhere you'll actually find again. Not to prove anyone wrong today. Just so that on the night it finally matters, and it usually does eventually matter, you'll still trust your own hands enough to climb the stairs and do the work anyway. That is where real expertise lies. Not in a ceremony, not in someone else's podium moment. It lives in the quiet, accumulated years you were patient enough to keep watching the water even after everyone else had already decided to stop. The soul of these stories comes from human experience, hard-won expertise, and the quiet discipline of people who keep doing the work accurately even when nobody's crediting them for it. AI assisted only in language refinement, so that timeless lessons about patience, judgment, and earned trust could move and resonate with viewers everywhere. Production team. Story and screenplay by Callum Reyes. Character development and visual conceptualization by Marguerite Solari. Video scripting and scene adaptation by Odalis Ferreira. A dedicated team committed to bringing this story to life.